Close your eyes and let the ancient world unfold. A world without cities, without kingdoms, without borders marked on maps, only endless horizons of grasslands, forests, and rivers where small groups of early humans wandered under the same moon. We see tonight. The air was colder, the nights longer, the silence broken only by the rustle of wind and the call of distant animals. Yet in that silence lay the fragile heartbeat of survival. For hundreds of thousands of years, our ancestors lived in scattered bands, gathering, hunting, moving with the seasons, their lives tied to the rhythms of nature. But even in this quiet existence, shadows stirred, tensions brewed, and questions lingered. Why did these groups sometimes meet in peace and at other times clash in violence? Why, in the midst of survival, did humans begin to fight each other? The answer is not simple, and I won't reveal it all just yet. But traces are buried in the soil, carved into bones, and echoed in the stories of every culture that followed. Scientists have found skulls cracked by deliberate blows, skeletons pierced by stone-tipped spears, remnants of massacres older than any civilization, proof that the roots of human conflict run deeper than kingdoms and kings. Yet the truth is stranger and softer than it first appears, for war did not rise all at once like a thunderstorm. It crept slowly, born from hunger, fear, competition, and something even more elusive: the fragile pride of being human. And as you drift deeper into this story, you will hear how the first sparks of violence flickered, how fear became strategy, how strategy became ritual, and how ritual hardened into the wars that would one day engulf the ancient world. But stay with me, because not every truth will be spoken at once. Some will unfold gently, layer by layer, like the firelight of a camp long extinguished, but never forgotten. This is not just the tale of battles fought. It is the tale of how humans, fragile and dreaming, discovered the most dangerous invention of all. In the half-lit dawn of human history, when our species was still scattered across the vast landscapes of Africa and beyond, the earliest whispers of conflict began not with armies or strategies, but with something far more primal: survival. Imagine small bands of hunter-gatherers moving silently through tall grasses, their eyes scanning for game, their stomachs hollow with hunger, their lives balanced on the edge of scarcity. And now imagine another band approaching from the opposite direction. Their needs no different, their desperation no less. Two groups, two fires burning in the night, both seeking the same water source, the same patch of sheltering trees, the same herd of animals. This was the stage where the first sparks of human violence were struck. Not yet war as we know it, but collisions born of necessity, clashes that left marks not only on bone, but on memory. Archaeologists uncover evidence from sites such as Jebel Sahaba in the Nile Valley, where skeletons more than 13,000 years old bear wounds from projectiles, suggesting that entire groups fell victim to sudden assaults, ambushes in the dead of night. Yet this story stretches even further back, 500,000 years, where broken skulls and fractured bones tell us that violence was not an invention of civilization, but an inheritance from the deep past. And here lies the mystery. Were these killings accidents of rage, Or were they the seeds of organized conflict? I will not reveal that just yet, but keep listening, for the truth lies in the slow evolution of human behavior, in the way fear of losing food transformed into the strategy of taking it, in the way suspicion of strangers hardened into hostility, and in the way cooperation within one's group made outsiders into rivals. What makes this story haunting is not only that humans fought, but that they learned, passing down lessons of defense and attack, watching, remembering, teaching. The very same intelligence that built tools and art also sharpened conflict. As centuries stretched into millennia, these encounters etched invisible scars into our collective mind, preparing us for wars that did not yet exist. And so, while the firelight glowed gently in the night, and the stars wheeled overhead in their silent brilliance, the first stories of human violence were being written, not in words, but in blood, in fear, in survival. But stay with me, because these were only the earliest shadows, and the true birth of war was still to come, waiting in the hidden spaces where survival began to turn into strategy. In the half-lit dawn of our species, when the earth was colder, when the forests stretched endlessly and the plains were alive with shadows of mammoths and wild cattle, human life was fragile, balanced delicately on the edge of hunger and hope. And it was in this fragile balance that the first sparks of conflict began to glow. Picture not soldiers in armor or kings on thrones, but small bands of people, fewer than 100 souls, wandering across a hostile world, bound together by blood, by trust, by the simple need to share fire, food, and safety, yet always wary of others who might cross their path. Every day was a negotiation with nature, but sometimes the greatest danger came not from the claws of lions or the fangs of wolves, but from other humans, whose eyes held the same hunger, whose hands gripped the same sharpened stones. When two groups crossed paths, the outcome could be as simple as cautious distance or as deadly as sudden violence. For every river, every grove, every herd of animals was precious, and there were never enough to go around. Evidence buried in the earth tells us this story quietly. Cracked skulls more than 500,000 years old bearing marks of deliberate blows, skeletons pierced by sharp points of flint, ancient bones unearthed at Jebel Sahaba in the Nile Valley, showing dozens of wounds from arrows, a frozen moment of massacre from nearly 13,000 years ago. These were not the battles of armies, but the clashes of survival, swift, brutal, and unforgettable. Yet something deeper was taking shape here, something that cannot be explained only by hunger or accident. Humans, unlike any other species, carried memory like fire. They remembered faces, they remembered betrayal, they remembered the sting of defeat and the thrill of victory. Each encounter left behind not just wounds but lessons, and slowly, across generations, the art of survival began to fold in the art of hostility. But what is haunting is that even in these early stages, violence was not constant. It ebbed and flowed like the seasons. Some groups shared food, exchanged mates, even formed alliances, but always there lingered the question of trust. And trust is fragile in a world of scarcity. a gesture misread, a resource withheld, a boundary crossed, and peace could dissolve in an instant. Was this war? Not yet. Not in the way we would come to know it. But the shadows of war stretched across those ancient plains, taking shape in the minds of our ancestors. The true beginning of war was not a single battle, but a slow awakening. The realization that taking from others could be easier than finding anew, that violence could secure survival, that intimidation could protect resources without a fight. And so, while the firelight of a camp flickered softly against cave walls, while children fell asleep to the hum of distant night sounds, somewhere in the minds of their elders stirred the knowledge that danger was not only in the teeth of predators, but in the presence of strangers. This knowledge was passed quietly, in warnings whispered to the young, in scars carried proudly or secretly, in stories of bloodshed retold as caution or legend. It was here, long before the first cities or empires, that humanity began to step down the path of organized conflict. The land itself seemed to conspire in this transformation. Harsh winters forced groups closer to scarce food. Droughts drove wanderers toward contested rivers. Fertile valleys attracted many feet at once, and every meeting carried the chance of either fragile peace or sudden death. And through all of this, the human brain, restless and creative, was learning. The same mind that carved tools from flint was carving strategies of defense. The same hands that painted animals on cave walls were also shaping weapons not just for the hunt, but for the possibility of human blood. But stay with me, for the story is not yet fully revealed, and what comes next will show how this fragile dance of survival began to harden into something more deliberate, something ritualized, something we would one day call war. As the centuries slipped into millennia, the scattered clashes of survival began to transform into something more deliberate, more patterned, almost as if violence itself was learning through human hands. And this transformation whispers to us, from silent bones and buried weapons scattered across ancient earth. Hunter-gatherer groups, once fluid and mobile, often found themselves circling the same landscapes season after season, drawn by rivers, herds, or sheltering valleys. And with repetition came tension, for returning to a place meant crossing paths, with others who believed the same land belonged to them. And here, in these contested spaces, the fragile balance tipped toward organized hostility. No longer just chance encounters at the edge of a forest, but premeditated confrontations, ambushes planned near waterholes, raids launched to seize stored food or captives, defenses built with sharpened stakes or stones carefully arranged to funnel intruders. Archaeological traces whisper this story quietly. Pits filled with the remains of men, women, and children who perished together, flint arrowheads embedded in bones, clusters of skeletons suggesting entire families fell in. Sudden waves of violence, and though no voices remain to tell us why, we can sense the logic. Resources guarded fiercely, territory claimed invisibly, revenge carried across generations. Even in this shadowy age before writing, humans carried ideas as weapons, and the idea of us against them may have been one of the most dangerous ever born. Within the safety of one's group, trust ran deep, but beyond the firelight, the stranger became a threat, And the act of uniting against an outsider may have strengthened bonds within, transforming conflict into a strange and brutal tool for social cohesion. It was no longer only about food or water. It was about identity, belonging, loyalty, and fear. Slowly, the outlines of organized war took shape. Scouts moving ahead to track rival groups. Alliances formed not for trade, but for protection against neighbors. And weapons evolving not only for hunting, but sharpened for battle. The hand axe and spear, once symbols of survival, now became instruments of dominance. And the discovery of the bow and arrow added a haunting distance, allowing humans to strike from the shadows, to kill unseen. Imagine the effect of this, the tension of silence before the attack, the sudden flight of arrows from the dark, the terror etched into memory. These were not armies yet, not the legions of Rome or the phalanxes of Greece, but they were their ancestors in spirit, the first stirrings of humans fighting not only for survival, but for power, for control, for the fear of being controlled. And here lies the paradox. The same intelligence that built shelters, tamed fire, and shaped tools also gave rise to strategy, ambush, and organized defense. What is most haunting is that in many cases, peace may have been an option, but suspicion was stronger, and suspicion often killed faster than hunger. Stay with me, because within these ancient wars lies the blueprint of every war to come. The seeds of territory, revenge, fear, and pride. And though the world of 500,000 years ago feels impossibly distant, the echoes of these first organized conflicts still beat quietly beneath the rhythm of our modern lives. When humans first began to scatter seeds into soil and tether animals to their settlements, everything changed, for no longer were they only wanderers drifting with the seasons. They were now tied to the earth, to fields of grain, to herds of goats and cattle, to clay jars filled with harvests that represented life through the winter. And with this permanence came a new danger. Their wealth could not move, and to protect it, they themselves had to stay, defend, and if necessary, kill. This was the moment when conflict deepened into war with roots as heavy as stone, and it was no longer only about food in the belly, but about pride, about identity, about rituals, and the gods they believed guarded their land. Farming villages sprouted near rivers, their fields gleaming under the sun, their granaries swelling with food, and suddenly, abundance itself became a reason for violence. For raiders could seize in one night what would take months to grow, but instead of dissolving into endless chaos, humans began shaping violence into a kind of order, cloaking it in ritual, justifying it with stories, sanctifying it with belief. The earliest shrines carved into stone whisper of gods of war, thunder, and vengeance, invoked before men marched with spears. Bones uncovered near ancient temples suggest sacrifices were offered to ensure victory or appease the spirits of the dead. Here, violence became something more than survival. It became destiny, even duty for entire communities. The first farmers were also the first to build walls, mud brick barriers that ringed their villages, symbols not only of defense but of division, the visible line between us and them. Behind those walls, people trained not just to hunt but to fight, young men learning to wield clubs, spears, and later bronze blades, their strength not tested against wild beasts, but against the men of neighboring villages. And yet, war was never constant. for trade still bound groups together. Alliances formed through marriages, and peaceful days stretched long between bloodshed. But the potential for violence was always there, simmering beneath the surface like coals hidden in ash. Ritual turned battles into more than raids. War drums beat to stir courage. Chants echoed through the night. Painted bodies marked warriors as chosen by gods, and death itself was woven into a sacred story of honor and remembrance. Evidence of this lies in mass graves where warriors were, buried with their weapons, or in carvings showing victorious kings standing over rows of defeated enemies. It was as if war had been transformed from a desperate act of survival into a theater of power, a way to write one's name in the memory of a people. Yet even here, in the flicker of torches around village fires, there was unease. For once war is ritualized, it rarely fades away. It becomes a cycle, one battle remembered by another, revenge for the dead fueling the blood of the living. Farming created abundance, but abundance created envy, and envy created organized violence, cycles that spun across centuries until war was no longer rare, but expected, anticipated, sometimes even celebrated. Still, the story is not so simple, for some of the earliest evidence of diplomacy also emerges here. Gifts exchanged, treaties carved into clay, promises sealed with ritual meals, and so war and peace grew together like twisted roots from the same soil. The unsettling truth is that once humans had something worth protecting, they also had something worth taking. And in this fragile new balance of wealth and fear, the shape of true war was born. The same war whose shadow still lingers across the world today. But stay close, because what comes after this is darker still. The age when leaders realized war could do more than defend. It could conquer, expand, and build empires from blood and ash. As small farming villages expanded into larger communities, something new began to emerge. Leaders, chiefs, and rulers who realized that war was not just a curse of survival, but a tool of control, a way to gather loyalty, wealth, and power that no harvest alone could provide. And with their rise, the very nature of conflict shifted forever. No longer was violence a chaotic clash between equals at the edges of fields. Now it became organized under banners, directed by commands, measured not only in lives lost, but in territory gained. Archaeologists have uncovered ancient fortresses with thick walls, towers, and gates dating back thousands of years. Places that did not simply defend fields, but proclaimed dominance, standing as symbols of a community's strength and the authority of those who led it. Chiefs and early kings began to weave war into their identity, claiming divine favor, presenting themselves as chosen by gods to protect their people and smite their enemies. And this belief gave war a terrifying legitimacy. Battle became not just survival or revenge, but a sacred duty to follow one's ruler, even into death. And as settlements grew into proto-cities, the rewards of war expanded. Captured slaves to labor in fields, stolen goods to fill treasuries, conquered land to feed growing populations. Leaders learned that war could unite their people under fear and pride, keeping rivals within their own walls subdued by pointing their anger outward. And slowly, a cycle took root in which power itself became inseparable from conflict. The evidence lies in the earliest written tablets where kings boasted of campaigns, in the carvings showing lines of prisoners marched before victorious rulers, in the ruins of cities burned and rebuilt again and again across Mesopotamia, the Levant, and beyond. These were no longer isolated clashes but campaigns, planned across seasons, with warriors trained and supplied, with strategies whispered across maps drawn in sand. Weapons too evolved. Stone and bronze blades shaped for killing men rather than animals, shields built to deflect not claws but spears, armor crafted to protect flesh from flesh. Even the chariot, a machine of speed and terror pulled by horses, emerged as a symbol of elite power, turning battles into theaters of prestige where rulers displayed their might before both gods and men. And yet this age was not only about external conquest. Within the walls, rulers used the threat of war to bind people in obedience. For if the enemy was always at the gates, dissent had to be silenced, unity demanded at any cost. It is here that war fully transformed into a political tool, a currency of power, and its echoes resound in the birth of the first true states, where borders were not drawn by rivers alone, but by blood spilled on fields. The unsettling truth is that many of the things we now call civilization, organized government, taxation, centralized armies, were shaped by the demands of war, by the need to supply, defend, and expand. But for all its devastation, war also became a kind of theatre of glory, with songs sung of kings who triumphed, monuments raised in their honor, stories carved in stone to outlast the memory of those who died screaming on the battlefield. And within this paradox, we find a haunting reflection. The same war that destroyed villages also built empires. The same war that took lives also gave rulers their power. Yet the more organized conflict became, the more catastrophic its scale grew. For no longer were battles measured in dozens of dead, but in hundreds, later in thousands, entire cities collapsing in fire. Stay with me, because this is the moment where war stopped being only about defense and survival, and became about expansion, ambition, and domination. A legacy that would carry humanity from these first proto-states to the vast empires whose shadows still stretch across history. By the time the Bronze Age shimmered into existence, humanity had crossed a line it could never return from. For war was no longer an accident of survival, or the ambition of a single chief, but a fully institutionalized system woven into the fabric of civilization itself, a machine with gears of armies, supply chains, and alliances that ground human lives into dust, at a scale the Stone Age could never have imagined. Bronze, with its unmatched hardness and cutting edge, became the new currency of power, and those who controlled its mines and trade routes controlled the battlefield, forging swords that gleamed like fire and axes that could split shields in two, while helmets and armor turned warriors into something more than human, living instruments of war. Armies now marched not as scattered bands, but as organized ranks, drilled to obey, their steps echoing like thunder across plains. And kings became generals whose legacies were measured not in harvests, but in the cities they conquered, the captives they paraded, The walls they leveled to ash. Fortresses rose higher. Walls encircled entire cities. Gates were engineered to withstand rams, and siege became an art of patience and cruelty, with attackers cutting off food and water until the screams of the starving echoed over stone. Alliances, too, emerged, binding rulers in fragile networks of promises and betrayals, where war could be sparked as much by politics as by hunger, and treachery became as deadly as the spear. In this crucible, the first professional soldiers were born, men who fought not as farmers defending their land, but as trained fighters supported by society, paid in rations, loot, or coin, and their existence meant war could be constant, sustained, beyond the rhythms of seasons. Even religion bent under this new reality. Gods became warlords in heaven, demanding sacrifices and granting victory, their temples filled with offerings stripped from the slain. The emotional toll was immense, for ordinary people lived under the shadow of armies that could arrive without warning, burning fields, enslaving families, leaving nothing but ruins to mark where life once thrived. And yet, in the midst of devastation, rulers carved monuments declaring triumph, writing history as if victory itself justified the suffering. In truth, war had become a paradoxical engine of civilization, driving innovations in metallurgy, transport, governance, and writing itself. For many of the earliest records we have are accounts of battles, conquests, and treaties etched into clay tablets or carved into stone. But beneath the pride of kings and the shimmer of bronze, the human cost was staggering. Entire cultures erased, blood staining the rivers that once gave life, and children raised in a world where war was not an interruption, but an expectation, as inevitable as the changing of the seasons. What began 500,000 years earlier as a clash over hunting grounds had evolved into a relentless system that shaped who would rise and who would fall, and its shadows stretch forward into every empire and every battlefield yet to come. Stay with me, because this was not the end. It was only the beginning of humanity's long and uneasy marriage with war, a bond forged in fire and bronze that still binds us in ways we are only beginning to understand. So when we step back and trace the arc from those first desperate clashes over a hunting ground to the organized campaigns of the Bronze Age, what we see is not just the story of war, but the story of us, a mirror reflecting both our brilliance and our brutality, a reminder that the same hands that carved tools from stone also carved weapons meant for one another. War, in its earliest spark, was about survival, a raw response to fear and scarcity. Yet as we grew, so did the scale of our conflicts, until they became tied to identity, ambition, faith, and the pursuit of power itself, shaping kings, states, and the very foundations of civilization. And here lies the haunting paradox. Without war, perhaps cities, governments, and even the concept of nations would never have emerged. Yet with war came devastation, loss, and a legacy of blood that still echoes across the world. It is easy to look at the past and think we have escaped it, that our modern age is somehow different. Yet the truth lingers in every border drawn, every army raised, every monument to conquest that still stands. War has never truly left us. The origins of war are the origins of humanity itself, and to understand them is to confront the dual truth that we are creatures of cooperation and destruction, builders and destroyers in equal measure. And perhaps the question is not why war began, but whether it must always remain with us, or whether one day we can finally break the cycle written so deep in our history.